Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with you all tonight. Tonight, we have a very special guest, so I'll be bringing him on. But hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. We're going to have yet another great show tonight. You can ask a question for me and my guest. It's going to be really, really good. So I'll introduce my guest when we bring him in. Here we go.
American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right, everybody. So our guest tonight is a writer. He's an anti-imperialist. He's a Marxist. He lives in Humboldt, California, and he'll be speaking at the Center for Political Innovations Conference coming up in Portland, Oregon. Let's bring on Rainer Shea. How you doing, Rainer?
I've been learning so much lately from following recent events, from following the recent reactions to the Gaza genocide.
Oh, yeah? What have you been learning?
Well, I wanted to come back on to give an answer to a question I feel you sort of indirectly have been asking over this last month, which is how do we respond to the unfortunate reality that so many of the ostensibly anti-war conservative figures who've been opposing aid to Ukraine have now been reaffirming their support for aid to Israel. And this is a big problem. This is really disgraceful. And you said, because of this, that I worry about the future of the anti-war movement.
Sure.
But here's the thing. I don't view this event as meaning that the Rage Against the War Machine coalition, that the united front against U.S. imperialism, which is formed in response to the Ukraine situation, I don't think this means that this united front has lost anything.
No. Yeah, go ahead.
None of the members of the Rage Against the War Machine coalition have left or split from one another because of the Israel situation. Everybody in this coalition is still together, still working on our projects together. The only types of people who I feel fit this description of hypocrites who have opposed aid to Ukraine but are supporting aid to Israel are the ones who are, well, they're more high profile than any of the members of our organizing coalition. They have more of a investment in the political process. They have more entrenched political interests that has seemingly given them a certain type of incentive to support the colonization of Palestine. And that's where the conclusion I've come to is, because when I saw this unfortunate phenomenon where all these people were coming out in support of Israel after opposing Ukraine aid, I was thinking, what could be causing this? What could be the material root of why these people are doing this? And then I thought back to the things that you've been observing so much about, namely the conflict between the two different main wings of the U.S. ruling class, between the highest levels of capital represented by the Democratic Party, especially now during the new Cold War. And that's in conflict with the lower levels of capital, which is now mainly represented by the Trumpian wing, the dominant wing now of the Republican Party. The highest level of capital is represented by finance capital, which does not necessarily mean banks, but industries, monopolies so big that they have fused with the power of finance. And the lower levels of capital are represented by all the types of industrial capital that are not necessarily monopolistic in nature. At least that's the understanding I've gained of this distinction so far. And what material phenomenon, what historical phenomenon is industrial capital tied to? What is mining tied to? What is the ranching industry tied to? These kinds of industries are tied to colonial extractivism. So it's unsurprising that all of these people who have been apathetic towards the project to wage war against Russia and destabilize Eurasia have suddenly come to care so much about U.S. imperialism succeeding when it pertains to a more direct form of colonization project, namely the Zionist colonization project. I feel like all these conservatives who are supporting Israel, even if they have had the sense to oppose aid to Ukraine, view Israel as an extension of the colonization project that they are invested in on this continent. Because, you know, you've talked about how the character of the USA has evolved over time, and I've talked about how the founding of the USA was not an all black and white thing, how it was essentially a progressive event. The reality is, though, that colonial extractivism continues to be a instrumental part of capitalism on this continent, and there is a large element of modern capital that's heavily invested in this extractivist project. So again, it's unsurprising that these people are supporting Israel. So on that point, when it comes to Zionist colonization, these two wings of the ruling class have been able to unite, and that's not a good thing. But as I'm going to get into, there are encouraging elements of our conditions as well. There are ways that we can navigate this situation so that we can build a iteration of the Palestine movement in the USA that is successful for the first time.
Wow, that's a lot to react to. I guess, you know, I have some thoughts on that, but before I do that, why don't you define extractivism? That's a term that I don't think our audiences are necessarily familiar with. So, do you want to define that, perhaps?
Well, I'm talking about the primitive accumulation kind of extractivism, which I'm sure is another one of those words I need to define. Primitive accumulation, from what I understand, is exploitation in its most naked and crude form. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when the USA has been extracting oil from Syria as part of its illegal occupation of that country, that is an example of primitive accumulation. That is an example of the imperialists extracting directly resources from a country that it is occupying, that the imperialists are occupying. And when the US government, when American corporations extract indigenous resources that they're only able to have access to because of the colonization project on this continent, that's modern colonial extractivism.
Just
in
like
a way that is comparable
seizing raw
to
materials.
Yeah, raw materials.
Okay.
And it's really comparable to how the Israelis are directly stealing Palestinian resources and land.
Well, you know, the term primitive accumulation, that's a big Marxist term, but it comes from Capital, Volume 1 Capital. The last chapter, the last part, I should say, not the last chapter, the final section of Capital Volume 1 is called On Primitive Accumulation. And in it, Marx is talking about how in order to create capitalism out of feudalism, the capitalists had to turn the feudal commons into private property. Because under feudalism, the king owned the whole country and he divided it up among nobles, and everything was basically the property of the king of the Commonwealth. But they had to create, privately owned land. You had to have privately owned businesses. And so they took the feudal commons, which was, the land that was all owned by the king, all owned by the nation, which was led by the king, and they broke it up into private property. And in doing so, then the people who lived there suddenly had to pay rent. They weren't just on the land, and suddenly there was like thousands and thousands of people that became homeless. And he then talks about how that then expanded to colonialism and seizing the Spanish first, seizing Latin America, and then the expansion into Africa by Britain, and the Portuguese expanding their influence, and how basically to go from feudalism to capitalism, there had to be a mass seizure of land and resources by the capitalists in order to become the new ruling class. That's kind of what it's describing. And I find that section on primitive accumulation to be one of the strongest arguments against this whole thing about socialism is theft. You've heard that before, right? Socialism is theft, right? These capitalists, they worked for everything they have, and we just want to take it away from them. Well, that section by Marx on primitive accumulation just shows that capitalism began with mass theft on a mass scale. I mean, they stole the land first from the peasants who'd lived there for thousands of years, then from the indigenous people, then from the Africans, then, and then the people say, well, socialism, there's a body count. And it's like capitalism began with a huge body count, first in Europe and then around the world. And that's kind of what I take from primitive accumulation. So you're basically arguing that these lower levels of capital, the way I hear what you're saying is that these lower levels of capital that tend to not be part of the club with the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies, they're still like settler kind of, right? They're still kind of the people, like Sheldon Adelson, he comes to mind, right? Sheldon Adelson is a big Trump supporter in Nevada, right? Big donor to Donald Trump in Nevada. He owns a lot of real estate in Nevada, and he's clearly not part of the club, and he likes Netanyahu. But he certainly doesn't like Biden and all of that. And it seems like, he's a lower level capitalist, but he owns a lot of property out in Nevada. And he identifies with Israeli settlers because they own a lot of property that's stolen from the Palestinians. And he sees them kind of as on his team, the Israeli settlers that the UN might be trying to restrain or passing resolutions to oppose. He sees them as like little lower level capitalists fighting the man. The way he is that kind of what you're getting at?
Oh, absolutely. I
Okay.
mean, what?
It's an interesting analysis.
Yeah, I just had to think, what is the material basis for industrial capital? What is the foundation of the wealth of these political actors who are so aggressively supporting Israel, even if they've, in a lot of cases, been apathetic when it comes to the project to destabilize Eurasia? And that's the conclusion I've come to, that colonization, the legacy of the seizure of an entire continent from the indigenous First Nations here, is holding back the project to defeat U.S. imperialism. It's creating this extra layer of support for Zionism.
Yeah, well,
and,
what I would also want to point out, there is a fight going on in Israel right now behind the scenes where Netanyahu is wildly unpopular with big sections of the Israeli population. And he kind of represents something very similar to the Trump phenomenon in the United States. His base are the settlers and the Jewish folks who have moved there since the fall of the Soviet Union, many of whom speak Russian or speak, not English or not Hebrew as their first language, that are from Eastern Europe. And they tend to be lower level in income than most Israelis, but they're much more right-wing, much more militaristic, and much more supportive of settlements in the West Bank, much more hostile to the Palestinians, whereas, your Israelis who've been there, maybe since 1948, they have a much more conciliatory attitude. They want to kind of maybe, be a little less aggressive with the Palestinians. And they want Israel to really focus on getting along with America and Western Europe. Whereas Netanyahu is saying, screw Western Europe, screw America, Israel for Israelis. You know what I mean? It's kind of like Trump saying America first. He says Israel first. He doesn't want to play ball with the overall imperialist agenda. He sees Israel as having its own agenda, separate from the overall agenda of Western imperialism. And I think that that's a factor, and that Netanyahu very much identifies with the new right in Europe. And that certainly throws a monkey wrench into this notion that the new right in Europe are all anti-Semites, right? The new right, at least the leadership of the new right, are huge supporters of Israel at this point, in really horrendous ways. Tulsi Gabbard has been horrendous in her support of Israel. I liked a lot of things she said before, but she seems to be canceling them all out right now. Max Blumenthal, he observed that, I mean, the way he put it is he said, conservatism, Inc. Is dependent on financial support from certain Zionist oligarchs. And I think that is really the truth, that there are a certain number of Netanyahu-linked billionaires, millionaires who are not part of the Western club, and because of that, they might want to get along with Russia better, and they might be not impressed with U.S. military interventions around the world, but they are very invested in Israel. They are very tied to Israel, and they are gonna be for Israel in this situation, and they see Netanyahu as their ally, as part of the Trump coalition.
Right.
So
right. When I was less developed in my theoretical understanding, I thought that all these factions were working for the same team in every sense. But I feel like part of why I abandoned the more vulgar form of Marxism that I used to represent, part of the reason why I abandoned Answer and PSL as a source for leadership for me is because I got a deeper understanding of the nature of our conditions. I came to understand that there really is a inter-elite rivalry both in this country and in Israel, as I've learned more recently. I think from you in particular, you taught me that. Because I've gained this understanding, I've gotten more of a sense of hope that we can achieve progress. Because what is the encouraging thing that we can take from this situation? Even though there is a large element of the right in this country that is never going to be willing to abandon Zionism, there is also an element of people who have identified with the right, often in a looser sense. I'm largely talking about libertarians, but a lot of MAGA people are compatible with this as well. There are a lot of libertarians and MAGA people who have the potential to come to the anti-imperialist stance or even to Marxism because they don't have the kinds of material investments that these right-wing figures we've been talking about have. A lot of them have a lot of good reasons to come to anti-imperialism or to Marxism. And that is the element that we need to make part of our outreach.
yeah, well, I've noticed the Libertarian Party is very solid. Now, they're not like, tweeting out Palestine flags and stuff, but they have just stuck to their anti-war position and their opposition to foreign aid very heroically. And it looks like there's a lot of pressure internally for them not to do so. But the Mises caucus that controls the Libertarian Party, Angela McCurdle, who's, the leader of the Rage Against the War Machine Coalition, along with Nick Brana, they've stuck to their guns, which is very admirable. Even though so many of the people and the so-called non-interventionist right have jumped ship, it seems like the Mises caucus and the Libertarian Party are there. The other thing, though, and this is going to get tricky, right? Because at the same time that we are opposed to Israel, we're also opposed to anti-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, right? The people who say the problem isn't capitalism, it's just the Jews, right? Now that's anti-Semitism, right? That's ethnic bigotry. That's poisonous and toxic. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that among right-wingers and conservatives who are against what Israel is doing. A lot of them have, unfortunately, an anti-Semitic analysis. This is all the work of some, mysterious conspiracy from the Israel lobby or something like that. What do you think about that?
I feel like Britain intentionally decided to exploit the Jews, Britain picked the Jews in particular as the group that they were going to use for this colonization project, or like use the idea of Jewish solidarity, creating a refuge for the Jewish people. They've been weaponizing the experiences of the Jewish people for many decades, and it's really disgusting. And I can see for a lot of reasons, like more than just the obvious ones, why so many Jewish people are outraged at the idea of Israel, because they clearly feel like they're being exploited, like the imperialists are using them to commit atrocities in their name.
Yeah, their trauma, their history is being taken advantage of in order to justify crimes by imperialism that don't even really serve the Jewish people; they serve imperialism. I think that's kind of what Norman Finkelstein is getting at in his book, The Holocaust Industry. He talks about his relatives who died in the Holocaust and how the horrible things that they went through have been cheapened, and turned into something to make a cheap political point and to raise money for causes that don't benefit the victims of the Holocaust in any way. And I think that's Norman Finkelstein. That's the point that he makes really, really eloquently in his book, The Holocaust Industry. Have you followed the stuff by Norman Finkelstein at all?
Only a little bit, but I've heard some interesting things about him, namely that he's been an outspoken critic of cancel culture. And that's really appropriate for what we've been seeing now, because we've been seeing the logical conclusion of cancel culture. The only people that cancel culture has benefited are the really sadistic, cynical types who have been working to persecute and you could say gang stalk the people who have been speaking out against Israel.
Well, I mean, there's the doxing truck, right? That's been driving around Harvard with the faces of all the students at Harvard who signed a letter opposing Israel. And this is a weird moment because the people who've been viciously targeting people like you and I for the longest time have been people from the so-called mainstream left, the woke crowd. And they have been the ones doxing people and canceling people and calling people Nazis and all of this. But for whatever reason, just because it's just basic woke logic is you always support the victim, right? You always support the victim. They are supporting the Palestinians right now. And so now they are being canceled. The same weapon that they've turned on genuine leftists is now being turned on them, right? And it's the right, the mainstream right, that is canceling and doxing them. So for the first time, we're seeing the woke left out of step with the establishment. CNN is not. They're having huge protests right now for Palestine all over the country, but instead of CNN covering them and like advertising them as it was doing during Black Lives Matter, CNN is not mentioning them, is covering them up. And here in New York, all the major newspapers are condemning them. There's talk about outlawing them. We had a member of the New York City Council show up at Brooklyn College with a gun. She said to protect the Jewish students from this protest that was happening at Brooklyn College. It was just absolutely ridiculous. And suddenly the woke left are getting canceled and called Nazis and getting doxxed. And that creates a moment where I feel like people like you and I, we can find a way to talk to them again. We don't want to pander. We're not going to pander. We're not going to change our messaging style. But that gives us an opening to talk to people on the synthetic left who might not have been willing to listen to us before. What do you think about that?
There are definitely more leftists who could undergo the kind of experience that I have in this last year, where I've stopped taking guidance from these cynical actors like the ones that answer. And that's encouraging. But the main people that we ultimately have potential to make into our friends, and you've been saying this lately, are the people who otherwise would never get involved in anything political. Bingo. The people who are alienated from politics because bourgeois politics has alienated them on a class basis. And that's where the African People's Socialist Party, which you said you wanted to talk about, comes into this. Because the African People's Socialist Party is an example of a Marxist project in the modern USA that is focused on anti-colonialism. But unlike so many of these online individuals who call themselves anti-colonial Marxists, the African People's Socialist Party, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, all the people involved in that, they've actually been succeeding at building a relationship with the masses.
And that's the key word there, building. They're builders. They're city builders. They're literally building cities. In St. Louis and in St. Petersburg, Florida, they're literally building. They're building farmers markets. They're building community centers with basketball courts in them. They're building centers for pregnant mothers to learn about healthy eating and et cetera. They're builders. And that is what is so important about the African People's Socialist Party. They're not burning it down and tearing it down. They're building. They are builders. You hit the nail right on the head there, Rainer. Go ahead. Continue. I just had to interject there.
Yes. That's why I think that African People's Socialist Party, shorthand for that is Uhuru. That's why I think Uhuru represents such hope for a genuine movement against colonization on this continent. One of the arguments, and this is kind of a side, but one of the arguments that I've heard from the African People's Socialist Party is that the thing that they're fighting against isn't exactly racism, it's colonization. They feel like the concept of racism is often used as a distraction from the real issue, which is there has been a hundreds-year-long colonial project wherein African people, Native people, and others, you could argue, like the descendants of indigenous people from Mexico, those are also Native people ultimately, have been subjected to systemic violence. And the way that we can address this violence is not by siloing ourselves off from anybody who is judged to not be compatible with the esoteric theories that these insular leftist spaces promote. The way we can address this is by building a relationship with the people. And I think that the African People's Socialist Party has a very important role to play within that, because we are doing our best to build a relationship with the people, but it's only really the new African wing of the communist movement that can build a relationship, that kind of relationship to that extent with the new African part of the American proletariat in particular.
But I got to tell you something, Rainer, which is very, very important, which is that, the Center for Political Innovation, while our message is obviously very different from that of the Uhuru movement, they themselves recognize that we are one of the only communist groups that takes seriously how much of a threat the political repression they are facing right now is. I don't know if you saw this, but tomorrow they are having their national march, that they're gathering, that the Answer Coalition is trying to mess up and all this, but they're having their national march. One of the speakers that will be on the main stage is John McCarthy, a member of the Center for Political Innovation. And Chairman O'Malley in St. Louis a couple weeks ago, they had a gathering to promote reparations and such. Chairman O'Malley mentioned the Center for Political Innovation 3 times in his speech at that gathering, and acknowledged the support that we have given them. Right. And it's weird because there's all these people on the internet who seem to believe that CPI are white nationalists, white supremacists or something. And yet all these people that are constantly saying, oh, you have American flags at your rally, so clearly you're racist. They are not. There's an actual group of black people that are facing criminal indictment, could go to federal prison as Russian agents. And they're not doing anything to support them. They're just, trading gossip about cults or whatever on the internet. Meanwhile, our group, that we're doing everything we can to support them. And it really shows you where all of this is at. I mean, it really kind of blows your mind that, a lot of people don't seem to understand that politics is not virtue signaling. Right? If all the Uhuru movement did was virtue signal on the internet and call other people racist and condemn America, the U.S. government wouldn't care about what they're doing. they're getting real stuff done. They're building real farmers markets. They're giving real classes to real pregnant mothers. They're building real community centers and real basketball courts. You know what I'm saying? And they're teaching ideology while they do it, but they're building a real base among the population. That's why they're being targeted. And in the real world, if you're going to do real stuff, you can't just be doing this internet purity thing. And I think that's what a lot of these folks just don't get. And that, like, yes, we see a real group of real Black revolutionaries being really targeted by the Department of Justice. And so we are on their side. And the Uhuru movement has said over and over again that they recognize, we, especially our member John McCarthy, who's done so much. I know Noah in Boston has also done work to support them. And we've had many conferences where they speak, and we made like a documentary film about their case. But I mean, we have done everything we can to support the Uhuru movement. Just a week after the raid on their homes, we gave them a platform at our conference, right? I called them up on the phone and I said, do we want to have them at the conference? And they came. And just a week after they were raided, they came to our conference. Tara Reid, the victim of Joe Biden, she was at the conference. We gave her an award at the conference for her speaking up against Joe Biden. But she worked at that point. She was a producer for Kim Iverson. And so she arranged for Chairman O'Malley to go on Kim Iverson's show because she met them at our conference. She then went on Tucker Carlson's show, and then she arranged for Tucker Carlson to cover their case, right? So they got on national television because of the work that the Center for Political Innovation did, right? We went out of our way to do everything we could to support the Uhuru movement. So, I mean, all these people that seem to think we're white nationalists because we wave an American flag or something. I mean, it's like, we're sitting here doing the best that we can to actually get stuff done. The internet is just a big, giant collection of it's a bunch of information, and there's so much of it out there, and there's so much that's wrong and confused that if you just make a contribution on the internet, it doesn't really mean anything. You have to do stuff in the real world. But I also wanted to mention this because you talked about how we're approaching people who would never go looking for this. And that's what the African People's Socialist Party is doing. They're aimed at the Black community, but they are, giving classes to pregnant mothers who would never go looking for a socialist or communist group and all of that. But that's what they're doing. They're going out of the movement to the masses, and they've been around for a long time, and they have a lot of resources, and they're building these community centers. We, the Center for Political Innovation, are just a couple years old, but I want to show you what we're doing. Right? Because you're speaking at our conference that's coming up December 2nd. I want to show you what's happening in Portland right now. Right now. This has already been going on. Like, as we are talking right now, this is happening. Right? I don't know if you've seen this. Right? These are going up. That's this thing here. I can't point to it on the screen. Those are door knockers that are being hung on residential doors in neighborhoods all throughout the Portland metropolitan area. People are waking up in the morning to find hanging on their doorknob a poster with a QR code on it, inviting them to come to the Dare to Win a World Beyond Imperialism conference. We also have posters that are going up on telephone poles and on billboards, etc. We have palm cards that are being left around. We are doing our best to try and get people to this conference that's coming up who would never go looking for this, right? And we're providing transportation also. So if they don't have a car or if they need a lift, we can give them a lift to go there. We're going to bring college students from the universities to our conference. We're going to bring, elderly folks or folks who need a lift in the area. We also, you are carpooling. We're getting like a van from California to bring people in from California. And then we're also bringing in people from Seattle. We have a bus coming in from Seattle, and we are going to make sure that this rally is full of new people who have never encountered this kind of message before, because that's who we need to be approaching. The African People's Socialist Party is doing that in their communities, in the Black community. We're doing that, to the public at large. We're not specifying any particular racial group, but it's the same approach. We're aiming at the masses, not at the so-called movement. So, you want to comment on that?
It's because of this hope that Uhuru and also you represent. And I'm talking about Uhuru in particular when it comes to the Black community, because I believe that Uhuru represents the modern incarnation of the Black Panthers. Huey Newton essentially said this when he stated in, I think it was 1986, we may no longer have the Black Panthers, but we have the Uhuru House. So we haven't truly lost something. It's because of this hope that Uhuru represents, that there is a kind of hope for bringing in the great masses of the urban populations, which I didn't believe was present until I started really looking at what Uhuru was doing. Because this summer I had a conversation with a fellow communist who his upbringing is different from mine in that I came from the left, whereas he grew up in a libertarian environment. So he has a kind of perspective that I didn't have, and I think he had a bit of wisdom that I didn't have, because I said that the revolution is going to be centered around the urban centers because that's where the great masses of the people are. So it sounds like that logically makes sense. But then he said, I don't think that's the case though, because in these urban areas, the only sources of supposed dissent are the ones that come from the established leftist orgs, and these orgs are not reliable sources of leadership. And he said, I think that the more reliable sources of revolution are going to come from the libertarians in the rural areas. So that told me a couple things, one of them encouraging, the other one depressing. But then I learned about what Uhuru was doing, and I concluded, no, we might actually be able to carry out this movement in both the rural and urban environments, and both of those elements of the American landscape.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in light of all of this, I want to put a picture on here because there's a figure that I never met him. He died, you know, when I was very young and I was not politically active as a small child. But this guy, he's pretty relevant in this conversation and everything we've been talking about Israel, about the Uhuru case, and now about how PSL is trying to block the Uhuru movement and stuff. I want to put this guy on the screen because this is a figure that not a lot of people know much about. He does have a Wikipedia page, but he's a pretty important figure in post-World War II American communism. This guy, that's Sam Marcy. Do you know the name, Rainer? Oh, you're muted, Rainer.
Oh yeah, what was the name? Sam Marcy?
Yeah, Sam Marcy. He was the founder of the Workers' World Party. And he was born in Ukraine, when it was still part of the Tsarist Empire. And when he was a small child, the Red Army rescued his family because the White Army was very, very anti-Semitic, and he lived in a small Jewish village. The White Army was terrorizing the Jewish villages, and the Red Army saved his family from being killed. Unfortunately, though, his family decided to flee to the United States. So he moved to the United States, and he was in the Communist Party during the 1930s. He was the leader of the Brooklyn Young Communist League. Eventually, he had kind of a falling out with the Communist Party. He became a Trotskyite, but he never really got along with the other Trotskyites because they were too anti-communist. So he started his own group called Workers' World Party. And I was in the Workers' World Party for 8 years. From 2007 until 2015, I was a member of the Workers' World Party. So I studied his writings extensively. And I also, I got to know a lot of people who had been mentored by Sam Marcy. And I've written critically. I think there are some real flaws in his worldview and his approach, right? I don't think this guy's a perfect guy. But PSL, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, is led by people who were trained by Sam Marcy. And they have completely betrayed everything that this man stood for. Brian Becker, the leader of PSL, that was his mentor, was this guy, Sam Marcy. And Brian Becker is completely going against Sam Marcy's teachings. For example, Sam Marcy never would have been neutral in Ukraine. PSL is neutral on the war in Ukraine. Sam Marcy would not have been neutral at all because it was personal. His family had been, directly persecuted by anti-Semitic, Nazi sympathizing, anti-communist Ukrainians. So he would never, I mean, his whole life was defined by the fact that, the Soviet Union had saved his family's life. So that's one way they've strayed from the teachings of Sam Marcy. But another way that they've strayed from the teachings of Sam Marcy is that Sam Marcy, he was always a huge supporter of black nationalists. He understood that the black people in the United States, that the lynching, the hanging of black men from trees and all of that, that's exactly what they used to do to Jewish villages during the pogroms in Russia. And he saw pictures of lynched bodies, and he read about lynching in the South, and he always had this gut level support for black nationalism and black revolutionaries, to the point that he went to some pretty extreme lengths. For example, when Minister Louis Farrakhan was being widely condemned as being anti-Semitic in the 1980s, he wrote huge articles why Jews should support Minister Louis Farrakhan. And even though Minister Louis Farrakhan, said some things about Jews that weren't very nice, he said it didn't matter because Farrakhan was the vanguard, it was the leader of the black community. And he was struggling against the system that gives birth to things like anti-Semitism. And he wrote whole articles about this. He also, and this is wild, he wrote articles defending the fact that, there was a leader of the Kenyan national liberation struggle who went and met with Hitler during World War II. And Sam Marcy said, you know what? They were struggling against British colonialism, and the British were their main enemy, and they were colonized people, and they have the right to get support from anybody to fight colonialism. And the same for in India, right? And he defended colonized people around the world. If they had felt it was necessary to align with one group of imperialists against another, he defended their right to do that. So Sam Marcy took some very rather extreme positions as a Jewish person, saying that the enemy of Jewish people is colonialism and imperialism, and that that means always standing with the oppressed, even if it's an uncomfortable situation. And I look at the life of Sam Marcy, and I will say he was wrong in a lot of ways. I think Sam Marcy didn't really understand that there's red states in America. I think he had a very movementist approach. I think he also he didn't understand that you could preach communism. He had survived McCarthyism, and he'd lived under McCarthyism, and he had in his head that you had to operate kind of in secret because the Americans will persecute you if you promote communism. And that hurt the communist movement. It would have been better if his followers were out there preaching communism in the streets. But so I've written critically of Sam Marcy, but I must say that, PSL is based on Sam Marcy's teachings. Brian Becker was mentored by Sam Marcy, and they have completely betrayed everything that Sam Marcy stood for. And that even though Marcy is flawed, the PSL, I mean, they're turning their backs on everything that the Workers' World Party, everything that Sam Marcy and all of them stood for. So always supporting black nationalism. Now we have PSL trying to prevent and block the really important March for Uhuru that's happening for tomorrow in Washington, D.C. Always opposing fascism and defending the forces who uphold the Soviet Union, et cetera, as anti-fascists. Again, we have PSL neutral in Ukraine. How can you be neutral between the U.S. imperialists and anti-imperialism? So I just wanted to get that out of my system. Do you have any reaction to that, Rainer?
I've witnessed firsthand how much Marxism has decayed. Before I even knew what Marxism really was, a year ago, and I told part of this story, a year ago when I was still part of the Peace and Freedom Party and supposed to be working under PSL, though they never really clarified you're supposed to be adhering to democratic centralism under the PSL, even though no formal arrangement was ever made. I never signed anything. Mm-hmm. PFP's constitution doesn't say that they're beholden to PSL. Anyway, a year ago when I was in that situation and these self-appointed attack dogs for the PSL were coming after me in response to my pro-Russian social media statements, one of the arguments I heard was that if you become too explicitly pro-Russian, then you'll be making the same mistake that APSP has supposedly made. And this was the argument that I heard. Supposedly, APSP has made the mistake of being so explicitly pro-Russian that the FBI has come after them. That's the argument I heard.
What?
Yeah, they said that it was essentially the APSP's fault that uh, the FBI has come after them, and that's the
Oh, geez,
implication was that's what you
Eugene
get
Debs.
for.
Eugene Debs, he made the mistake of being too against World War I, and so they threw him in federal prison. Geez, I mean, the Black Panthers, they made the mistake of just being too anti-racist, so the FBI persecuted them with COINTELPRO. That is a crazy argument. That's just horrible. I don't even know where to begin with that. How is it a mistake? How is it a mistake to exercise your freedom of speech? Right? That's crazy, Rainer. I'm sorry I had to cut you off there, but continue. But I've never heard anything like that before. That was a mistake to be too pro-Russian. Oh boy. Oh wow. That was a mistake. Okay.
Yeah. Using the Uhuru raid as evidence for why PFP shouldn't be pro-Russian. And there is a reason why leftists like these are able to rationalize things like that. It's because they view the struggle to prevent the destabilization of Eurasia and the ethnic cleansing of the Russian speakers in the Donbass. They view these things as not too important because supposedly Russia is is synonymous with right-wing politics, and they view that even though these people are pro-China, they are really apathetic when it comes to Russia because
they're Democrats.
Yeah, well, they're Democrat tailius, and so it doesn't ultimately matter that they claim to not support the new Cold War.
It's worth pointing out, I've observed this too, that right now, the way it used to be during the Cold War, it was the Republicans were the hard right militarists and the Democrats were the ones who said, well, let's negotiate. But often the Democrats ended up being the ones to start the wars because they were like on the defensive because Republicans were calling them soft on communism. Truman did the Korean War. Lyndon Johnson did the Vietnam War because they were constantly being accused of being, soft on communism. So even though they mouthed the line of let's negotiate, they often ended up being the ones to start the wars. But that was kind of the good cop, bad cop routine. As the Republicans, Reagan, Nixon would be like, bomb them. We're right wing. We're militaristic. The Democrats would be like, well, let's negotiate. We're a little more conciliatory. But now, in a period where Western capitalism is collapsing, now what we're seeing is the two major parties are playing favorites, right? And because the Miami Cubans are really, really, really Republican, right, with Marco Rubio and all of that, the Democrats are the ones who sound like they're more friendly to Latin America, to Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. They're not. Obama put horrendous sanctions on Venezuela. There's many examples of, Obama tried to set up a Cuban Twitter to stage a color revolution while he was down there. And, but the Democrats at least pretend that they're more friendly to Latin America. And because the hard Israeli right wing, they tend to be super, super Republican. And with Trump, the Democrats tend to be friendlier to the Muslim community, but we see Joe Biden is still supporting Israel blindly and giving Israel whatever it wants. So it's not completely that case. So it's like Republicans on the other hand, act like they might be more friendly to Russia or North Korea. Donald Trump went to North Korea, but you saw nothing came of it, right? John Bolton ruined it. And even though they had 3 meetings, ultimately nothing came of it, right? We hope that those talks can be resumed. And then, Trump also spoke nicer about Putin's, et cetera. But then you'll notice Donald Trump also ripped up, nuclear treaties with Russia. He sent lethal aid to Ukraine. So it's like a different routine. The Republicans pretend to talk nice to North Korea. They pretend to talk nice to Russia. The Democrats pretend to talk nice to the Muslim world. They pretend to talk nice to Latin America. They pretend to talk nice to China. But at the end of the day, it's the same imperialist state that overall has the same agenda, but they play favorites now. So when you look at the PSL, can't be too pro-Russian. Can't be too pro-North Korean. But we're going to play up endlessly that we like Cuba. We're going to play up endlessly that we like China. We're going to play up endlessly that we like the Palestinians. They're just Democrats. That's really all that's going on here, right? They're not anti-imperialists. They are for one wing of the ruling class that pretends to talk nicer to one section, to some countries while not talking nice to the others, right? And that's what we're seeing here, and it's particularly blatant what they're doing, right? Because Russia and China are economically tied closer than they have ever been. And this is another thing is you get some people that want to be like, well, Caleb, Russia's not socialist. Okay. I mean, they don't say they're socialist, right? They maintain they're definitely not a socialist country. They maintain they're capitalist. They do have a huge amount of state ownership and involvement in the economy. But at this point, right, Russia is, it's not led by communists anymore. Marxism is not their ruling ideology. But especially since the Ukraine special military operation, when the USA has put all these crazy sanctions on them, who are they trading with? Who are their closest trading partners? China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. They just built a huge statue of Fidel Castro in Moscow. There's a really close relationship with Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. So it's like there is a huge bulk of the world that is run by communist parties and has a socialist economy. And Russia's economy is locked out of all the Western capitalist countries, and it's very thoroughly integrated with the socialist countries. So you can say, well, they're not socialist, Caleb. They're capitalist. It's like, so what? I mean, at this point, they're so tied in with the global socialist apparatus, and they're so cut off from the Western imperialist economies. Why does that matter? That's like a moot point. You know what I'm saying? It's like a way that you can somehow try to gain credibility by denouncing Russia. Well, they're capitalists now. They're not. So what? So what? You know what I mean? Like, that'd be like, imagine if you were back in the time of the civil rights movement, and there were a whole bunch of racists sitting around going, that Martin Luther King, he's an awful person. He's horrible. And you said, yeah, Martin Luther King's not a communist. Like, why would you say that? It's like, I mean, Martin Luther King wasn't a communist, but it's like, why are you trying to like gain credibility with your enemy? Yeah. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, that's what I see when I hear people make a big show out of Russia not being communist. It's like, what point are you making? And, PSL, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, they're the ones that always like to do a big show of, we condemn Russia for not being communist. And it's like, who are you kidding? Like, who are you kidding? That's what I think. What do you think, Rainer?
Oh, yeah, I feel like we've been struggling against these ideas, both of us, for a long time. And at a certain point, you just have to say, these people are wrong. Now, let's go towards getting out of the movement into the masses, because that's really the point of this all. The reason why it is necessary to talk about the Marxyists at this stage, though, is because they are bigger threats to the success of the class struggle than the Trotskyists, than the Maoists, than the anarchists, and the social democrats, because the Marxyists are more effective gatekeepers.
Yes.
They present themselves as Marxist-Leninists. The reason why I trusted them for so many years was because they are pro-China, or they posture as pro-China. So they look like the most credible and attractive thing. And but then they started feeding me these weird ideas. It got mixed up with these online communities that were telling me to be hostile towards anybody who is not meeting their standards for what a real communist is. Scandal mongering.
And I don't necessarily think they're really pro-China. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not pro-China in the way that I and you and I are. Okay. Right. I've got behind me 2 volumes of The Governance of China by Xi Jinping. And I think that if you're a real Marxist, Leninist, and
Yes, France.
Hey there. Can folks see me? You still there, Rainer? All right. So here I am. And now I'm going to let Rainer back in. Hey, Rainer.
Oh, I hope people weren't too confused.
Yeah, my internet just went off. It just went off completely in the middle of the interview. First time that's ever happened. I don't know what that was about, but I tried to reconnect a few times. It just does that every so often. It's very, very annoying. So I'm here and I'm just doing it on my phone. So there we go. Let me see if I can see what's going on here. I've never seen anything like this. But here I am. Right?
Yes,
So.
you were saying about you're saying about how these Marxists, or people who now call themselves Marxists, are claiming to be pro-China, but they're not.
Yeah, well, I've got here, The Governance of China by Xi Jinping, right? And I've studied the work of Deng Xiaoping. And that, I believe that China is a great success story. They've made themselves the second largest economy in the world. They've lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. They are the success story of socialism, and we should be learning from them. However, if you read Brian Becker's writings on China, and if you read Fred Goldstein's writings on China, both of them have it like China has lost their way because they're not the Soviet system anymore, right? That's basically they think it's still socialist, but it's like they're revisionists, like they've lost their way. And I don't think that's really supporting China. If you're like, well, okay, they're socialist, whatever, but I don't know. I mean, that attitude, I don't think that's genuine support for China, because the Soviet Union is gone and it's not coming back. And if the Soviet system was the way to do things, if that was like the ideal model of socialism, other countries would have adopted it. But if you look at Venezuela, you look at Nicaragua, you look at other countries, other socialist countries around the world, China, China, of course, Vietnam, even North Korea and Cuba, they want to move closer toward the Chinese model. And I think that shows that China, it's not that China should be an example of, well, we still support them, but they lost their way. No, I think we should look to China as an example of modern socialism that should be learned from. Not that they don't have flaws. I mean, I think the Chinese are first to tell you they need reform, around issues of corruption, and they're constantly reinventing and adjusting their system. But this attitude that China is bad because it doesn't have the Soviet model, that is what I get from the Marcyite tendency, and I don't think that's real support for China.
Yeah, and the thing is, the individual I was talking about who made that terrible Uhuru mistake argument, they don't even agree with the idea that China is revisionist. And they're just one of many thousands of people within these leftist spaces who has become invested in a project such as PSL. PSL ain't the only one that does not provide optimal leadership. And I'm really glad that I was able to break out of that. Now, the next step, and you talked about that last month in one stream where you said that we shouldn't be obsessively focusing on the synthetic left forever. We need to be getting beyond the synthetic left. The next step is to build a movement that is effective. And I think that a combination of Uhuru's leadership and the leadership of these groups within Rage Against the War Machine, which are oriented around reaching out to libertarians or conservatives who are compatible with anti-imperialism, a combination of that is what is going to win us the class struggle.
Indeed. Well, let me add also that, what I'm emphasizing right now, and you've emphasized this too in some of your writing, is the need for a network of people who can work with each other to do in real life stuff that are anti-imperialist, right? And that is what is really important right now. And that CPI, we are not a democratic centralist organization. We're not a Leninist party, because I don't think that would work. There's a million Leninist parties in the United States, and that's just not going to work in terms of organizing right now. Maybe at some point something like that could come into existence. But right now, if you want to work with people, you're going to need people who have different political lines. You're going to need to work with people who have different perspectives and don't agree on everything, and tell people that they don't agree. You're going to have people have their own social media in the group and put out their perspective, which might be different than what the group itself puts out, right? That you can't, the democratic centralist way of doing things, where everyone is required to give the party line under all circumstances, whether they agree or not. All disagreement is kept internal, where once a decision is adopted, all members are obligated to carry it out or they get expelled. That level of discipline, I mean, that's admirable. That's a kind of a military style of organizing that was very effective for the Bolsheviks in taking power and has been very effective around the world. But to implement that right now among people in the United States who are anti-imperialist, would only lead to fracturing and disagreeing. If I went to the next CPI meeting and said, all right, everyone here has to agree with me about whatever, and everyone here also, our next activity, everyone is obligated to participate in it or they're expelled, we would our membership would shrink exponentially, immediately, right? And we wouldn't be able to work with as many people as we work with. We're not in the conditions where people are at the point that they're ready to be that dedicated and committed to carrying out the goal, unfortunately. And also, in 1910, if the Bolshevik Party just had one newspaper, that expressed its views, that was one thing. Now everyone's got a Facebook, everyone's got a Twitter. You and I are on here streaming. And if you want to compete in the information warfare that's going on, you can't micromanage people the way that you would have to in order to, democratic centralism. If we were both in a democratic centralist organization, the central committee of our respective parties would have to be watching every minute of this to make sure what we said was the party line. And how could you do that? Right. And do you know what I'm saying? It's not realistic with the amount of information there is out there to exercise that much control over what information is out there. And that I see people implementing democratic centralism in the United States right now as an impediment, as a weakness. It gets in the way. It prevents them from doing the kind of outreach and organization that's needed. I want every CPI member, if possible, to have a YouTube channel, and I don't want to have to approve everything they say on the YouTube channel, for them to have it. Maybe they disagree with me about something. You know what I'm saying? And the point of CPI is we're a socialist education project, right? We're educating people about socialism, and we're promoting anti-imperialism. We're fostering discussion, and we're raising awareness about anti-imperialist issues. But we're not a democratic centralist organization because that wouldn't serve our purpose. We're trying to build a network of people that are anti-imperialist. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely understandable that you've taken this path, and I feel like it's made it so that for years you've been trying your best to do what Rage Against the War Machine is doing, which is bringing together as many anti-imperialists as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in these next couple of years, that's the timeline you've given for when you'll transition towards fully in real life organizing. I think in these next couple of years, you're really going to become safe from the threats, the kinds of threats that you came to face during those years in a way that you never were until you finally make that transition. And because you described the craziness last year as a good and necessary purge of the elements that came to you and had bad intentions and broke and really did some reprehensible things. Those are the kinds of risks that come with being so open.
Well, let me just say this. Somebody texted me today, somebody who's a CPI member, and they said, hey, I'm just curious. They said, how many members did you have last August at the time of dissolution? And how many members do you have now? Right. And so I gave him the straight up numbers, because to join CPI, it's just a matter of filling out a form on a website. Anyone right now can join CPI. Just go to cpiusa.org and put your credit card information in. $10 a month, you're a member. Very easy, right? So at the time that we dissolved back in August, we had 260 or so members. Now we have 127. However, there's a big difference, right? And someone says, well, that looks like you lost members. Well, yeah, we did. But here's the thing. The out of the 260 people that were paying dues last August, less than 10% ever went to any CPI meeting, ever went on our weekly Zoom calls. The bulk, the overwhelming majority of those people, at least 200 of those people, were just paying dues on the internet and doing absolutely nothing else, right? Whereas now, out of our 127 members, I would say about 60% of them come to our events. We have been having Saturday Zoom calls, CPI, since CPI started. Every week we have a Saturday Zoom call at 3 p.m. for all members. It's like open membership Zoom call, right? Before our dissolution, it was usually 8 to 10 people on every Zoom call. Now, there's not a week that goes by that we don't have 14 or 15 people on the Zoom call on Saturday. Sometimes it gets up to like 26, 27. So the people that we have now are way more dedicated and loyal to the project. You know, and a lot of the people that were just kind of, it was just kind of a passive form of internet entertainment. You know, we appreciated the $10 a month that helped us, you know, put on conferences and events, but those folks are gone. You know what I'm saying? And that's an important thing, right? You know, Lenin said better, fewer, but better. Yeah, you know, that's an expression that was used. And that, you know, look, hard times tell you who your friends are sometimes. You know, I mean, they do, right? You learn through hard times who your real friends are. And there were some people that were along for the ride because it looked like I was well connected. It looked like I had, you know, connections in the alternative media world, and they thought they could, you know, through being in CPI, they could maneuver their way into, you know, making money or getting themselves a position or something like that. Well, that's not what CPI is. You know, CPI is not a resume builder organization. This is a group of people that are committed to building socialism in the United States. You know what I'm saying? You know, and also there were a number of people, I think a lot of people who had joined CPI were just people who, you know, they're part of the internet universe. There's some certain personalities that were friendly to CPI for a long time. I'm not going to name names, but you know, that were friendly to us, but they never built an in real life organization. And they just kind of do this internet entertainment thing, right? And I was a character in their internet entertainment universe, right? I'm no longer a character in that internet entertainment universe. And I don't want to be at this point. I've kind of decided, you know what? It's just so toxic. I don't even want to be a character in their internet entertainment universe. I'm building an in real life organization. So I think a lot of those people, you know, for them joining CPI was just, it was like a way to be more involved in the show. Right? They watched this internet TV show, and joining CPI was a way to like be more involved in the TV show. You know, it's really weird. I get random people in New York City will know who I am and walk up to me sometimes. And sometimes like when I'm out doing things, and it's always interesting because, you know, sometimes the people are very friendly and other times the people know absolutely nothing about me. Right. You know, I don't want to share too many stories because this like encourages people to act stupid and stuff like that. But I always think of there was a guy who was on the Waltons, the old TV show from the 50s, and he drove across the country. He drove through West Virginia. And the story was that he went to a store in West Virginia and he went to the counter and this woman goes, "Oh my God, are you the guy on the Waltons or whatever?" And he says, yeah, that's me. And she says, "Well, you need to tell your dad, you know, blah, 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 blah." And he said, I'm an actor. Like that's a character I play on TV. It's not real, you know? And she said, "Oh, I know that, but you really need to tell your dad," you know? And she like didn't get that like TV wasn't real. Do you know what I'm saying? On some level, she just didn't get it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And that like BreadTube isn't real. You know what I'm saying? And there's a lot of people who just don't understand that BreadTube isn't real. Like I'm a real dude and I'm not like a villain in like a BreadTube fantasy. I'm not a neo-Nazi. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not, you know, I don't know what. I mean, I've been called a lot of things and it's like, I'm a real dude. You know what I mean? Like I'm actually real. I'm not like your favorite TV character who just kind of walks onto the set, who walks off the set. And that's what I feel like a lot of when I meet like a Vosh fan or a Destiny fan or a ContraPoints fan, and they walk up to me and they're like, "Oh my God, are you Caleb?" And you know, they think it's like they're meeting the bad guy on their favorite Netflix TV show. Right. And I'm just like, no, like I'm not that character. I actually am a real dude. If you watch my streams, I'm a real guy who has real beliefs, you know, and I mean, it's kind of a weird thing. Right. And it kind of shows you like, you know, reality TV isn't real either. You know that, right? Like reality TV, they don't have writers because they have to pay the writers, you know, fees from the Writers Guild. They have what they call like concept editors, right? Who basically map out what the story is and tell the people. And reality TV is just as fake as you know, as regular TV, as sitcoms are, right? And so I feel like in the BreadTube universe, and Peter Coffin and I have talked about this many times, in the BreadTube universe, I am like a villain character in like a weird reality TV program that a lot of these BreadTube people watch. And it's a little bit strange. And that's why someone was asking if I'm going to the rally tomorrow. I mean, John is going to do a great job representing CPI. He gave a great talk at the Uhuru event, and we're going to have multiple people there who will be, doing outreach and supporting Uhuru. But no, I try to avoid going to left spaces if I can, because the people who see me think I'm a character in their favorite reality TV show, and I'm a villain character, and I'm a, it's pretty wild. So yeah, that's just kind of my thoughts. Maybe this is kind of random and disjointed, but it's just kind of my thoughts here. I'm a guy, right? And what's weird is, I am fully accessible. I think that these streams are suppressed. I don't think they show up in people's news feeds like they should. But I'm pretty accessible. You can watch me. I stream twice a day now, usually a noon stream and then an evening stream. So if you want to know who I really am, just watch my channel. Unfortunately, there are very big channels that have blown up, these big videos telling you who I am. And that ain't me. That character that is in the Thought Slime videos and stuff, that's not me. I mean, that's just not me. Anyone who's ever met me knows that's not me. So, I mean, if you're mad at a fictional character, I'm sorry to hear that, but there you go.
Yeah, the people who are watching this right now are, I think, one of the most valuable types of audiences that I could be speaking to right now, because they're the ones who are most likely to take seriously the lessons that I'm trying to impart about what we need to do for the future of this movement. And even though they're suppressed, as you said, fewer is better. And you have clearly cultivated a community of people who take this job seriously. I'm really glad to hear that this experiment, despite those big obstacles that it encountered, has ultimately been successful.
Thank you. Well, the other thing I want to throw out, there's a couple things that come to mind, Rainer. That first of all, when I see the Palestine rallies, I'm really glad that all these people are out in the streets marching for Palestine, right? And especially now that the mainstream media is stigmatizing that, I'm really glad they're doing it. But I haven't been going to those rallies, but my wife has. And she commented to me, she said, these are just the same rallies that have been happening for Palestine for the last 10 years, the last 20 years. They're just the same as they've always been. And I just can't let myself be satisfied with that. 12 Palestinians are dying every hour. And we're doing the rallies the exact same way we've always been. I can't be satisfied. Like, I just can't go to bed and be like, all right, well, we're having great big rallies the same way we've always done. So there we go. I just can't be satisfied with that. Before the CPI conference in Portland, we're going to have a Palestine rally of our own. We're going to bring American flags and Palestinian flags. And we're going to have signs that say money for American jobs and schools, not for Israel. Right. And we are going to talk about how we need to, bring services and build up our own economy here in the United States, not send money to Israel to kill Palestinians. Right. And we're going to have a different approach, because we want people who would be put off. Maybe they'd be put off if they saw the Muslim flag or the Muslim community out there with the Palestine flags. But they see a bunch of people with American flags saying money for America and not for Israel. They might support that. Right. And we're going to do things a different way to appeal to a different group of people, and that's going to be our way to make a contribution, because we're not satisfied. And that said, when I talk about how the Palestine rallies are the same way they've always been, I must say the same thing about a lot. If I wanted my social media to be really, really huge, all I would do is just get on there and say things that people already think and reinforce them, right? Because that's what a lot of big social media accounts, they find out what a lot of people already think, and they tweet it out, and they maybe find a couple paid accounts to boost them or whatever, and that's how they grow. Well, I don't do that. I want to make a contribution, and making a contribution, that's called tailism. That's what Lenin called tailism, where there's people who think something, and you say, oh, I think that too. You're not making a contribution if you do that. Malcolm X, if you listen to so many of Malcolm X's speeches, many times in his speeches, he says, I know you don't want to hear this, but, right? And Malcolm X, he's not telling the Black community what they wanted to hear. He's telling them what they needed to hear, right? And that some people have said that that's a real friend. A true friend doesn't just tell you what you want to hear. A true friend will tell you what you need to hear, right? A true friend will bring you bad news, right? If it's necessary. A true friend will tell you ways you could improve. Now, they're not going to run you down and like tear you down, but they're going to try to build you up with constructive criticism. And one thing that I have noticed is that that a lot of our political communities are just kind of populated by people that are just kind of satisfied with things as they are, and we can't be satisfied. We can't be satisfied with Yahoo facing 10 years in prison. We can't be satisfied with 12 Palestinians dying every hour around the clock. We have to try new things. We can't be satisfied with a huge chunk of the American people who have no idea what you and I believe and why we're talking this way. And we have to get out of the movement to the masses, and if the Palestine rallies happening the way they are happening right now was going to change things, it would have done it a long time ago. So we have an obligation to try new things, to break out of the box. And I must say that I've noticed that CPI, we are a lot like, have you ever heard of the Velvet Underground, the rock band?
No. Well, sounds like they're underground, right? So I haven't heard of them.
Well, yeah. Well, it was a rock band with Lou Reed and Nico, and they were a rock band in the '60s. They weren't anywhere near as popular as the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or whatever, and they didn't sell as many albums. But everyone who they used to say that everyone who bought their albums started a band, and that they did stuff before the Beatles did it, and they showed it could be done, and then the Beatles picked up their methods and adopted them, right? They did stuff before the Rolling Stones did it, and the Rolling Stones went to their concerts and listened to all their albums. The Beatles listened to all their albums, and they were what they call avant-garde. They were doing things with their rock music that had not been done before and showing people that it could be done. And by doing that, opening space for people to, that had more to risk, right? Because the bigger you are, you have more to lose, right? So you can't take as many risks when you're bigger. But if you're smaller, you can take more risks. And they were opening up space for then bigger people to do that kind of thing. And I've already seen that happen with CPI. Look, there's a certain prominent Marxist. I don't think he would appreciate me saying his name on here, so I'm not going to say his name. There's a certain prominent Marxist that I spent some time with at RT. And he used to never defend the Soviet Union, defend China, defend Cuba. If anyone asked him about socialist countries, he would just say, "Oh, I believe in worker cooperatives. That doesn't count." And I talked to him, and I showed him stuff I had written, and I talked about how we should defend the heritage of the Soviet Union. We shouldn't let them say socialism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And I remember he looked at me and he said, "You can say that?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, and it's okay to say that? And I said, "Absolutely." And then I noticed he started talking that way because I did first, right? He assumed that was just too far out of what was acceptable in political discourse to talk that way. He's an economist. He knew it was true, but he just assumed that was too far away from political discourse. But by me going out there and saying communism didn't fail, it was successful, it defeated the Nazis, invented space travel, that opened up the space for him to start talking that way, right? And I feel like that's a huge achievement on my part. I opened up by doing what I did on a smaller scale, I opened up space for him to do the same thing on a much larger scale, right? And I also feel like there are certain internet communities, again, not going to name names here, that weren't around for a long time. It was just BreadTube and me. And I was the punching bag of BreadTube. I was the Nazbol villain of BreadTube, right? And they saw what I was doing, and they emerged with a messaging style very similar to mine because I showed that you could do it. Do you know what I'm saying? Right? By doing the social media brand, doing what I did on social media, I showed you can do this. You can be a Marxist and not denounce the USSR and not believe in degrowth and be patriotic. And that opened the door for other people to do it. Right? So, I again, we're playing kind of a vanguard role. Right. This is when you talk about vanguard, not in the Leninist sense, but in just what the word means. The vanguard means the front line, the soldier on the front line. That's what we are at CPI. Right. That's why we're called the Center for Political Innovation. That's what innovation is. Right. When you try new things, you innovate. And that's what we're doing at CPI. I think we're doing it quite successfully. Right. So that's my defense of the CPI and our legacy. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, like I said, it's experiment that has grown into something that I'm really proud of. So many people have doubted it, but the evidence is right there that it's successful. I need to take a drink of water.
No, that's no problem. I got my water right here too.
Contribution I want to make is bringing up this book and the reality it speaks to, the Jakarta Method, an account of the biggest anti-communist campaign in history. Now, I wanted to talk about this extensively in my speech at that conference, but when I consulted you about it, you said maybe I should tone that down because I'm speaking to a certain audience. You got to always take that into account, even if the things you plan to say are correct. The Jakarta Method was the model that the CIA and its lackeys within the Indonesian military used to slaughter hundreds of thousands of communists during the 1960s. And this was the event that, well, many consider it to be the event that won the U.S. the Cold War. And that was how they won against communism, by slaughtering hundreds of millions. And a lot of these people were just individuals who were judged to be vaguely associated with left-wing politics, with left-wing affiliations. They picked off everybody they could find who was judged to be a threat. And when I see the Center for Political Innovation and its adjacent organizations being successful, I can't help thinking of the Jakarta Method, because as soon as a communist project becomes a serious threat towards the ruling institutions, history has shown that those institutions take this threat seriously, and they can respond in unimaginably brutal ways. The context within which this violent campaign took place was a situation where the Indonesian Communist Party was one of the biggest communist parties in the world at the time. Mm-hmm. It was big enough and strong enough to be able to influence the government towards anti-imperialist policies. That's how strong the Communist Party was.
Yeah, no, they had a president like Suharto or Sukarno, one of the two, who was more or less a communist. Yeah, he was aligned with the Communist Party. Yeah.
What I have been trying to convey for years is that the threat which we face from the state is dire, it is extreme, and it is something that we absolutely need to take into account. And the mistake I was making for years was assuming that these people within these insular leftist circles were the ones who the state was the most concerned with countering. But now I've come into circles that I see are really superior in their practice. The CPI and its adjacent organizations are actually trying to bring back the successes of 20th century American communism. And when the communist movement gets sufficiently rebuilt, that's when we're going to start seeing attacks these attacks aren't going to look exactly like they did in Indonesia. This is different conditions here, but they are going to be equivalent. They are going to be extreme. I believe they're going to involve the mass application of the treatment that they have applied to Alexander Finnegan, the person I talked about the last time, who over this last year has been subjected to gang stalking. He's been subjected to targeted harassment, to targeted threats, really well-coordinated threats from the FBI and from counter gangs that the FBI has been working with. And now he's had to flee the country because he really has felt like his life is in danger. I believe that's going to be the primary type of anti-communist, broader anti-imperialist warfare that we're going to see. The kinds of attacks that Uhuru has experienced are going to be expanded as well, but I don't even think those are going to be the primary types of attacks. In the long term, I believe that our government is going to shift beyond the court system and just move straight towards political assassinations, equivalent to how they've assassinated people abroad through their drone warfare. It could be a repeat of the political assassination wave that the USA saw during the 60s when so many black radicals got executed by the state.
Well, Rainer, I think that one thing you have to take into account is that every revolution in history has started out as a division within the ruling class, right? That, the Russian Revolution, the Tsar was losing the war. He was incompetent. And under those circumstances, the bulk of the capitalist class wanted to remove the Tsar. And the Bolsheviks had been protesting for down with the Tsar and, against the autocracy for years. But because the ruling class wanted to remove the Tsar, their protests and their strikes suddenly were getting the approval of the government. And the Tsar was forced to step down, right? And then after the Tsar was forced to step down, there was a big division in the ruling class of Russia about whether they should continue World War I or not. And that led to, the Bolsheviks aligning with the anti-war faction, which was mainly Russian capitalists who did business with the Germans and didn't want to have a war with the Germans. And then the provisional government, they were constantly having strikes, down with war, end the war. The provisional government was suppressing them. But then General Kornilov, tried to become the military dictator and overthrow the provisional government. And so the Bolsheviks defended the provisional government. And in the course of defending it, they basically were so good at organizing like militias and stuff that the government was handing over the armaments, and they had like bigger militias and stuff. And then after they defeated Kornilov in his attempt to overthrow the provisional government, then they were able to take power. And the Chinese Revolution was a similar story. Japan invaded China, and Chiang Kai-shek didn't even want to fight Japan, but his generals did. So they kidnapped him and forced him to sign an agreement with Mao to fight Japan. And then Japan, had invaded China. And so the Chinese communists aligned with Chiang Kai-shek to defeat the Japanese, but they proved themselves to be like the most effective and heroic fighters against the Japanese. And then they tried to have a coalition government with Chiang Kai-shek after the war, and Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't do it because the USA wouldn't give them Marshall Plan aid. And so, they recruited a lot of Chiang Kai-shek's biggest followers. And then Chiang Kai-shek had this great idea to confiscate all the rich people of China's gold and give them this currency for it. And then that currency crashed and all the rich people lost their money. And many of them said, okay, even the communists have got to be better than this clown. And they went over and they made a deal with Mao, and Mao told them, don't worry, we're not going to nationalize your property. And so then they went over and supported Mao. And finally, the Chinese communists took power. But it was through a series of alliances, right? With factions of the ruling class that were fighting against each other. And that is why I have been so obsessed with figures like Tulsi Gabbard, figures like RFK, figures like Michael Flynn and stuff like that, is because if we're going to have any chance of succeeding here, it's going to be because we enter strategic alliances with different factions of the ruling class, right? If we don't, and I've been telling people in CPI this for a long time, right? If we don't make friends over here pretty soon, we have friends around the world. I'm the leader of the delegation to the World Youth Festival in March, right? And I've been to many socialist and anti-imperialist countries and stuff. We don't have friends over here. The U.S. government's going to crush us. They're just going to see us as foreign agents, as enemies, right? And we're not foreign agents. We're the biggest patriots we can be. We're advocates of socialism. We believe in anti-war stuff because it's good for America. But if they just see us as people that are sympathetic with the enemies of the United States around the world, they're just going to crush us. But if they see us as useful allies within a fight within the ruling class, that gives us an opportunity to exist. Do you know what I'm saying? Right?
Yes.
And that's why I've been widely attacked, because I'm friends with Reverend Milhan Stevens. Have you seen the streams with me and Reverend Milhan Stevens?
Milhan Stevens. Not familiar with that name.
Yeah, well, Milhan Stevens, he's the pastor of Manhattan Family Church here in New York City. And he's born on the Korean Peninsula. He's, born in South Korea. He's of Japanese heritage. And he's a Moonie, right? He's a follower of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. But, the Moonies believe in peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. That's one of their beliefs. They believe that the Koreans are God's chosen people. They have their own beliefs that are certainly not my beliefs. But, when we shut down in August, I talked to some of my friends in the Korean Friendship Association, and I talked to some of my friends that do DPRK solidarity work, and they said, go check out Manhattan Family Church. Go make friends with them. So I did. I went there and I said, look, I'm interested in learning about your religion. This is me. I know you guys are really anti-communist. I know that you're Republicans and conservatives, but I know you want peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I know you guys, and it's true, they are really the ones that are responsible for Donald Trump going to North Korea. You know that, right? Donald Trump spoke at their 9/11. They had a 9/11 gathering with Reverend Mrs. Moon. Donald Trump spoke at it, and for years, they own the state-run car company in North Korea. It's they're one of the main business contractors with North Korea. If you look up their history, right, they have a lot of businesses in North Korea. They do business with North Korea. They're one of the only American and South Korean groups that's able to do business in North Korea. And so I went and made friends with them. And a couple months ago, the BreadTube crowd discovered this, and they tweeted out, "Oh my God, Caleb's a Moonie." I'm not a Moonie. Right. I know. And they know I'm not a Moonie. Right. Their beliefs are not my beliefs. They're very anti-communist. They believe communism is the Antichrist and all of that. But they also believe that North Korea is a misunderstood country that is widely demonized. And they understand that a lot of what we hear about North Korea are lies. And they believe that if North Korea and South Korea can come together, that can be the future. Right. That can be the future of bringing peace to the whole world. They read the Bible, the story of Cain and Abel. The two sons of Adam and Eve, and how Cain killed Abel, right? And they argue that there's Cain civilizations and Abel civilizations, right? And that if Cain and Abel can reconcile and forgive each other, then then the Garden of Eden can be restored. And they see North Korea and South Korea as representing Cain and Abel, right? And that's their religious teaching. Now, so I'm friends with them because we need to have friends over here. And this is a faction of the American political establishment. They own the Washington Times, which is a big newspaper, a big Republican Party newspaper in Washington, D.C. They own the New Yorker Hotel, which is a very successful hotel here in New York City. And they support North Korea, right? So I went and I said, look, I want to work with you guys around peace on the Korean Peninsula. And then they did a march on May 27th. They did a rally at the United Nations, for peace, unity, and reconciliation. And they gave a platform to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that has been outlawed, that's been accused of being Russian agents by the Ukrainian government. They gave a platform to a Ukrainian Orthodox priest to talk about how his church is being persecuted in Ukraine by the U.S.-backed regime, right? And they had this beautiful peace march. And we brought people from the Rage Against the War Machine rally to their rally, right? And there's some people that don't like me doing this. Well, I'm sorry, but it's again, if we just want to be crushed, right, we can just be on the outside. We need to make friends over here. And it seemed to me that there's a faction in the ruling class that, for whatever reason, wants peace with North Korea. And I want peace with North Korea. And I said, you know what, CPI, let's find a way to make an alliance, right? And, in the past, I've been friendly with the LaRouche movement, the followers of Lyndon LaRouche. They are obviously historically quite anti-communist and such, but they support the Belt and Road Initiative, and they are friendly to Russia and China. And so I'm happy to work with them, and that we need to find people within the American power structure that have some diverging interest from the overall interest of American imperialism and become useful friends and allies to them. That is what we have to do. It's kind of a necessity, right, at this point, because if not, we're just going to be crushed. And that's when you talk about the Jakarta method and all of that, right? There's a reason that that Abraham Lincoln allowed August Willich, who was a friend of Karl Marx, to become a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. You know why? Because he was a damn good general. He had fought in the 1848 German Revolution. He was a really good general. And the same for Joseph Wedemeyer, who became a leader of the Union Army. He was like a high-ranking leader of the Union Army during the war, right? There's a reason that that Roosevelt invited leaders of the Communist Party and the labor unions to come over to the White House for many meetings because he was fighting against the threat of a fascist coup. Roosevelt was against the Nazis, but there was a lot of American capitalists like Henry Ford, like J.P. Morgan, who were sympathetic to the Nazis. And Roosevelt was they were plotting against him. So Roosevelt entered an alliance with the communists, right? And so, that's the 1930s. You saw the Communist Party flourishing because they were in this strategic alliance with Roosevelt. The way we can protect ourselves from the kind of stuff you're describing is we have to form an organization, right? We have to form an organization that's capable of carrying out operations. And when we see an opening like this, we have to jump on it. And we have to just be good friends and allies of one faction of the ruling class that we have some agreement with on some issue, whether it's the Korean Peninsula, whether it's building infrastructure. I think there's a lot of capitalists who wish that the roads were paved better so people could come drive to their stores and buy things, I think there's a lot of capitalists that are worried about the opioid epidemic, and that we need to find ways that we can be useful to different factions in the ruling class while we build up our own forces. What do you think of that?
Oh, that is definitely the plan that we need to go by. And I already had some idea that that was true, but I think it's just until now that you made it clear to me just how important that is. As I have been learning for a while how useful it is, how valuable it is to build these networks. But now I realize how deep these networks need to go. We don't just need to ally with the Libertarian Party. We need to ally with certain elements of the ruling class itself. And what the unfortunate thing that's been happening over this last year or so is the ruling class has been booting the Libertarian Party out of their club by cutting off their funding, partly in response to Libertarian parties doing the right thing on Ukraine. So now the Libertarian Party is becoming more marginalized. And it was a necessary cost for them to take on. It was good for them to do the right thing on Ukraine. But that's the dilemma that everybody within this movement faces when they do the right thing and they lose these connections. And ultimately, I think that fear is what drives the Marcyites. It's why the Marcyites are so terrified of doing anything too transgressive.
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, in my book, Letter to Bob Avakian, right, I started out by talking about how, the RCP last summer, or a couple summers ago, I guess, or no, it was last summer when Roe v. Wade was overturned. They have it in their heads that they need to align with the Democrats, that the Republicans are the main threat, Trump is a Nazi, etc. They're very pro-abortion. And so they went all in, for protesting in favor of abortion rights. They formed this group called Rise Up for Abortion Rights, and they organized very effective rallies, and AOC spoke at one of their rallies and all of that. But what happened? Vice magazine, Vice News, the Daily Beast, the Intercept all ran hit pieces calling them a cult and saying that this cult had infiltrated the pro-abortion movement. Planned Parenthood and all the major pro-choice groups, NARAL and all of that, signed a document saying that Rise Up for Abortion Rights and the RCP were not welcome at their events. And in this book, I talk about that was basically Joe Biden and the ruling class telling the RCP, we don't need your help, guys. We don't want you. Good riddance. And that's what Joe Biden is doing to the left right now with Palestine, right? He was happy to use them to drive Donald Trump out of office. He was happy to use them to protest against Republicans for being racist, but they're against Israel. And you know what? He supports Israel. So, and AOC, she signed a letter just denouncing all the pro-Palestine rallies that are happening, right? And DSA has apologized for supporting pro-Palestine rallies lately. The Democrats are basically saying to all these people that are pro-Palestine, yeah, we don't want your help. We don't need you. That's what they're saying. And this strategy of assuming that it's always the Democrats that we need to align with, that's a really outdated strategy. The Communist Party during the Cold War, that was their strategy. Because during the Cold War, the Republicans were the militarists and the Democrats were the ones that negotiated. That's ancient history. That's ancient history. Roosevelt died a really long time ago. The Berlin Wall fell down. Like, this is that strategy, that orientation that Democrats are always the better ones to align with. That's null and void. Now, it could change. I mean, it could be like that. It was certainly like that during the Bush years, I would say. The Democrats were the better ones. But right now, I think that, now the Israel thing has thrown everything for a loop. And we're going to have to see what happens when the dust clears. But, at this point, in some ways, the MAGA wing, because they're more disruptive and they're more opposed to the overall agenda of the imperialists, in some ways, they are better, right? They favor economic growth. They're not trying to push fascist degrowth stuff and Malthusian economics. In some ways, they're slightly better. Now that, the way they're so pro-Israel now, that has certainly caused, there's a need for a realignment. But we're not loyal to the Democrats and we're not loyal to the Republicans. We're loyal to anti-imperialism. We're loyal to the people of the world resisting the rule of Wall Street in London. We're loyal to American working families. That's who we're loyal to, right? And any alliance that we make with anybody around any issue is based on that loyalty, right? And this notion that we're loyal to, well, the Democrats are just always better, or that's got to be gotten rid of, you know? It's very interesting because, you know, the Roosevelt and the Communist Party had an alliance in the late 1930s because Roosevelt was anti-fascist, right? But before Hitler took power in Germany, Stalin actually took the position that social democrats were the main danger. He called them social fascists. Did you know this?
Oh, yeah. That's one of the first things that I learned as a communist.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, that changed, obviously, when Hitler came in. Then he aligned with the Social Democrats. But originally, Stalin said the Social Democrats were the main danger. And a lot of the capitalists who ended up becoming fascists, before they were fascists, they were more willing to do business with the Soviet Union, which is something that gets kind of obscured because later, you know, obviously when they were fascists, that relationship came to an end. But Stalin wrote about what he called captains of industry and how they are more progressive than bankers and financiers, right? The financiers and the imperialists, they're thinking about the global trade route, maintaining economic hegemony globally. Whereas the industrial capitalist just wants to make products and make money. And a lot of the earliest capitalists to invest in the Soviet Union were industrial capitalists, captains of industry, and they were also the ones who became fascists later. So obviously, when they became fascists, the Soviet Union couldn't align with them. But when they were just industrial capitalists, that's who the Soviet Union was was willing to do business with because they were renegades, because they were not in with the overall, you know, bulk of the ruling class. And at the same time, the Social Democrats, who Stalin said were the main danger, the Social Democrats, a lot of them were being paid by the financiers, you know, and Stalin's interview with H.G. Wells is really important. And I think people ought to read that interview, right? And some of the speeches that Stalin gave in the early 1930s are very important, where he gets into this. And he says, look, you know, Henry Ford, he came to the Soviet Union and he built a car factory. The Soviet Union needed to make their own cars. So they made a deal with Henry Ford, and they paid Henry Ford some money, and he went and he gave them the plans and the designs, and they set up the Soviet car industry. Well, Henry Ford later became a fascist, and later Henry Ford was one of their greatest enemies. But during the early 1930s, their greatest enemy wasn't Henry Ford. Their greatest enemy was the Social Democrats. It was people like H.G. Wells. It was people like the Labor Party who were working for the ultra rich. And Henry Ford, they could hire him to come help set up a Soviet car factory. And you know, Lenin says over and over again in his book, What Is to Be Done? He says, if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours, right? Meaning that what we do today may not be what we do tomorrow, right? And that we have to constantly be going back to the drawing board, constantly saying what's working, what's not working. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party does. They have constantly been evolving and adapting and changing. And that's how China has been so successful, is they're constantly changing their policies. You know, whereas the Soviet Union fell because it needed to change and it couldn't change. It tried to change, and the change led to them falling apart, right? And that I would argue, you know, the Marcyites, you know, they have not changed their tactics in 50, 60 years, right? They're staging big leftist rallies in Washington, D.C. That's what they've been doing since the early 80s. That has been what they do. They have not changed. Whatever the Democrats and the liberals are doing, whatever the latest trendy liberal cause is, they reserve the permits, they set up the stage, and they try to become king of the protest cage around that. That is an outdated strategy. That is not a strategy to win in our times, right? In our times, we can actually get to the masses. In the 70s, you couldn't do that. In the 70s, the bulk of America didn't want to hear communism. But that's changed. You know, Bernie Sanders got a huge amount of votes. You know, anti-war sentiment is very widespread. Americans don't trust the government. You can get to the masses now. And it's urgent. It's much more important to get to the masses than to be king of the protest cage. That's my critique of Marxism.
Yep. And
yeah.
In this last month, it seems like we've found out that the strategy of trying to get certain figures within the ruling class, within these lower levels of capital, isn't working. Like if we're expecting them to be principled on anti-imperialism, that's not working. And like I've explained, the reason behind that is the legacy of colonialism on this continent.
Yeah.
It's apparent that incomprehensibly traumatic event in world history is still having terrible effects. The world is still reeling from that, and the genocide against Palestinians is just one of the many parts of the legacy of the genocide of Native Americans. It's continuing to mess things up.
Yeah.
But
There's a.
there is
Oh, go on, please. Yeah.
there is hope. Hope exists in organizations like the African People's Socialist Party. I wanted to show this pin that they sent me a while back.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I will say that part of colonialism is psychological, right? Have you ever read Rudyard Kipling?
I've definitely heard of him.
Yeah, Rudyard Kipling was a British writer. He wrote children's books, he wrote poetry, and he was a huge advocate of colonialism. He actually wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden, which is a blatantly white supremacist poem. It was supporting the USA in colonizing the Philippines. It was basically saying it was the white man's burden to colonize the inferior peoples or whatever, right? But if you read a lot of his poetry, if you read a lot of his short stories, it really points to the tragedy of colonialism, because he has a poem. I forget the name of it, but it's about a redcoat, a British soldier, who tries to eat in a fancy restaurant, and they won't let him eat there. Right? The guy's like a British soldier. He's a redcoat. He's got a red uniform, and he tries to go into this fancy restaurant, and they see that he's wearing a military uniform, like he's a working class guy, and they throw him out. And he's angry about it. And the poem ends with this idea that, you know, that the way he can get his recognition, the way he can get some respect, is by going to India and beating down the colonized people, right? And that is the ugly, ugly reality of colonialism. That, you know, if you join the military, anyone who's ever been in the U.S. military tells you it's rap music and country music, right? It's low-income white folks from Appalachia, from the South, from trailer parks, and it's urban African-American folks. It's rap music and country music. You know, and it's the people who've been the most kicked around in this society, the people who've been the most, you know, bullied and abused, who've lived with the most deprivation, you know, and they go into the military, and that's their opportunity to get some respect. You know what I'm saying? And that, if you read Rudyard Kipling believed that. He was writing for the British working class, and he's saying the way you can get some dignity in this world, the way you can get some respect, is to be a colonizer. And that is an ugly, ugly reality. And, you know, a lot of colonized people may not appreciate this message. I understand that. They might hear this and say, Caleb, I don't want to feel sorry for the people who invaded my country. I don't want to feel sorry for the people dropping bombs on me. I don't want to. Well, that's okay. You're in the developing world. You're fighting for your freedom. You don't have to. We're here in America, right? And we have to figure out how to build an anti-imperialist movement. And that is one thing we have to recognize, you know what I mean, is that the people who become the foot soldiers of imperialism, the people who become the enforcers who go around dropping the bombs, you know, tend to be the people who get kicked around the worst, and they're trying to get some redemption. They're trying to get some respect. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
You know, I can think of a lot of different stories. You know, like when I was in high school, you know, there were a lot of kids at my high school who joined the U.S. military. But there were a couple women who joined the U.S. military, and often they were women who were, you know, being abused or you know, had an upbringing that was, you know, less than pleasant. You know what I mean? And for them, if you really knew why they were joining the Marines or joining the military, it was about trying to get some respect. It was about trying to show I'm tough. You know, even though I'm a woman, I'm not going to be kicked around. You know what I'm saying? And that is an aspect of this that I think a lot of people, a lot of the left, they want to just shame people in the military. They want to shout, oh, you're a baby killer and all that. No, we have to recognize these are people that are very brutally oppressed in this society, who have faced, you know, poverty, who have faced bad conditions. And the imperialists have basically utilized their desire to get some respect in this world, their desire to gain some dignity, their desire to be a hero. They've taken advantage of that. And they're using that, right? And that's something we have to keep in mind. That's something we have to keep in mind, and that's an aspect of the psychological. You don't gain self-respect by bullying somebody else. You don't. You know what I'm saying? You don't gain self-respect by oppressing somebody else. But a lot of people think that. A lot of people are convinced by that. It's easier. It's like a shortcut. They say, well, rather than standing up to my oppressor, I can just help my oppressor oppress somebody else, and then my oppressor will respect me. No, he won't. No, he won't, right? We know they use U.S. troops as guinea pigs. Did you know this? They text the vaccines on them, right? And the Gulf War syndrome, read about it. They were testing vaccines and all of that. They throw their lives away. They don't gain respect, but it's a shortcut. The way to gain pride and to gain self-respect is to stand up for yourself against your oppressor, and is to unite with other people who are being oppressed and find your common ground. That is the way you gain self-respect, the way you gain dignity in this world, right? But that's a hard thing to do. It's a lot riskier. It's a lot more dangerous. It's a lot scarier, right? It's much easier to just try and please your oppressor by helping him oppress somebody else, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work, there's this whole myth that during slavery, they made the movie Gone with the Wind. And if you watch Gone with the Wind, you'd think every white person during slavery lived in a big fancy palace and all of that. Well, actually, the truth is in the South, white workers, their wages were exponentially lower than workers in the North. Why? They were competing with people who worked for free, slaves, and that the conditions, the bulk of white workers in the South, they didn't have public education. They were not literate. They didn't have public education. Their conditions were far worse. And even today in the South, right, the level of industrial development has been held back by slavery. The existence of slavery prevented industrialization. And that's why there's so many military bases all over the South. And that's why you don't see high wages. And the labor movement in the South never gained the strength. All the anti-union laws, they talk about right-to-work states that have these anti-union laws. They're all Southern states. They're all Southern states because the labor movement is weak because of racism, right? And our message has to be that racism hurts all workers. It most especially hurts the oppressed, but it hurts all workers. And that by being racist, by aligning with the colonizers and the imperialists, you're not helping yourself, right? This has to be the message. It can't be the message of trying to shame the white worker and say, well, you have it too good. You have it too good. You should feel ashamed. That's not going to work, right? The message has to be that if you want freedom, if you want dignity and respect in this world, you need to stand with the black people. You need to stand with the people of the Middle East and Africa and Asia against Wall Street. That's the way to gain respect. That has to be the message. And that was the message of the Communist Party back in the day, right? They said to the poor white workers in the South, the only way you can get freedom is if the black people get freedom, right? And by putting the needs of the black people at the front of the struggle, you're going to advance. But if you try to team up with your white boss to oppress the black people, you're only going to get poorer, right? And there's many examples of that in the labor movement historically. San Francisco, the dock workers of San Francisco had horrible pay, horrible conditions, and they were all white, and they had a white union. It was like a racist reformist union. And every time they'd go on strike, the black people would be used as scab labor, and the strike would be broken. But then when the Communist Party took over the dock workers union in 1934, they went to the black churches and in the black community, and they said, one of the demands of our strike is going to be that black people get hired to work on the docks. We are going to have a hiring hall. So we choose who gets to work on the docks, not the bosses. And we're going to make sure that at a certain percentage of the jobs go to black people. And so in 1934, when the communists led the dock workers of San Francisco and they went on strike, the black community supported it. All the other unions supported it, and they won. And still to this day, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU, is one of the most radical unions in the country. And there's a lot of black dock workers who got hired because of that. And the whole working class gained because the black community, their right to work on the docks alongside white people, was put at the front of the struggle. There's many examples of that, many examples of that. In the Flint sit-down strike of 1937, there was only one black worker in the auto plant, and he was a janitor because they wouldn't let black workers work as assembly line workers. But when they occupied the plant, and they marched out victorious. It was the black auto worker who carried the American flag as they marched out of the plant. And that was a message. They were saying he's just as much a worker. And when they signed a union contract, one of the demands of the UAW was that black workers had the right to work in a factory alongside white workers and get rid of the ban on black people working in the assembly lines. And that's how they were able to be victorious. And that has to be our message, right? And we need white workers to understand that they don't gain anything by helping oppress black people, that their liberation is through the liberation of black people, through the liberation of colonized people around the world. That has to be the message. And if it's a white guilt thing, if it's trying to shame them, we're only going to fail. That's where I differ with the new left. What do you think, Rainer?
Yep, that's the message that I've had to internalize. I've never believed that it was impossible to radicalize, or impossible for the American working class to radicalize towards a revolutionary state. But for a while, I was framing things in a flawed way, because one of the first dang resources that I came across when I entered into these weird leftist niche spaces was Settlers by Jay Sakai.
Yeah.
It's really awful. But basically, what Settlers argues is that modern America is totally equivalent to Israel, and therefore revolution can only come from the colonized workers. That unity is impossible. This is obviously a wrong message if your priority is to win and to seriously study conditions instead of to virtue signal. And I'm thinking about opportunities for how we can build the kinds of alliances you're talking about that are able to make the defeat of the state possible. I'm trying to think of figures within the military who are acting principled on Israel in ways that Tulsi Gabbard has not.
Yeah.
Well, there's General Douglas MacArthur. There's Scott Ritter.
Mm-hmm. He's speaking at our conference. Did you know that Scott Ritter is going to be speaking at the Portland conference? Right?
Yeah,
he's confirmed. We got his hotel room. We got him a flight. He's coming in. He's going to be one of our main speakers.
I know. I might need to look up. I hope one of us can look up what is Douglas McGregor's position on Israel. I think I misspoke his name. Douglas McGregor has been a major source of dissent on Ukraine. But what has been his reaction to Israel? I'd be surprised if he's a Zionist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we shall just have to see. That book, Settlers, I'm curious. I've done some research and some other people have. I'll tell you what I know about it, what I've observed, because I don't really have the answer. I just have some observations. But what do you think? I mean, what do you make of Jay Sakai? Who is he? Where did this book come from in your assessment?
From what I've heard, it was written in the context of wanting to polemicize within the American Maoist ultra-left movement in the 1970s and 80s. And the person who wrote it, I'm definitely suspicious of him, just because of the extent to which his ideas are seemingly designed to damage communism in this country. I've written every page of Settlers, and even when I was in that ideologically flawed state a few years ago, I was not able to accept one of its key conclusions, which was that he was writing in 1983, was when he said this. He claimed that as U.S. imperialism continues to decline, and thereby the living standards of the American people continue to decline, he said supposedly the white workers are not going to be able to be brought towards a revolutionary consciousness. He said, they're only going to do what they've done in the past, which, according to him, is consistently betray the colonized workers. But this argument was itself predicated on a one-sided account of history. He was citing parts of American history like the 1930s. He was pointing to examples of white workers who, real or fictional accounts of white workers betraying colonized workers. Some
Yeah.
of that had truth, but it was in the context. It was in a certain context that he was leaving out. He was only portraying the worst of it. He was not inclined to talk about all the stories of unity, of solidarity.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even about my hometown in Ohio, when I grew up, it was maybe 10% black, but now, I mean, there's a lot more black people. There's a lot more people from India, of Indian heritage. There's a lot more people of Latino background. Middle America, parts of Middle America that used to be all white or whatever are much more integrated. There's way more interracial relationships now. There's way more, integrated neighborhoods now and stuff. The idea that in response to economic conditions getting worse, all of the white people are going to become white nationalists and white supremacists. I just don't think that's possible. I think too many of them have black grandchildren. I think too many of them have black neighbors or best friends. Yes, racism is there. Yes, race prejudice is there. Bigotry is there, absolutely. But I don't think that, again, yeah, in the 50s and in the 60s, even in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot more just like straight up white neighborhoods where they were terrified of the black people, and their response to any economic crisis was going to be just to blame the black people and try to repress them further. But I'm not sure that that's the prevailing condition in Middle America right now. And then a lot of people say, well, Trump is a white nationalist. There's a lot of black people who like Trump. There's a lot of people of Indian heritage who hate Muslims who like Donald Trump. It's Donald Trump, certainly, the anti-immigrant stuff, and there's a lot of problems with Trump, but I don't think he's making a white nationalist appeal necessarily, right? Trump is appealing to people on many different levels. He just said he wants to give free college. He wants to set up an American online college that's free. Trump is coming up with all kinds of different ideas. He'll work any angle he can. I don't see Trump as a white nationalist necessarily. One thing though about that book Settlers, right? So the first time I encountered that book Settlers, it was a printout. It was not like a physical book. It was a photocopy. It was a printout that a prisoner in Ohio showed me, right? Because I was doing prison work in Ohio with people in the Youngstown State Penitentiary. And in prison, if you are interested in radical ideas, almost immediately back in those days, you would start getting, in the mail, this newspaper called MIM, for the Maoist Internationalist Movement, MIM Notes. Remember this? Does this ring any bells?
So.
Yeah, and it was this communist group that no one had ever met anyone from, but prisoners would just start getting their publications. And it took the line that all white people were inherently reactionary and oppressors. It was Maoist, third worldist. And you would just find their newspaper places. Every so often you would find like a stack of their newspapers, but no one ever identified anyone from this group. It was just this mysterious group that took that position. And then the founder of the group was a Korean American guy named Henry Park, who died. And when he died, it was revealed that he had been the leader of this group, and he lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the group was very secretive, and there were never very many members of it, probably like 20 or 30 people in it. But their literature was pushed in the prisons like crazy. And they are the ones that really promoted the Settlers book. And they got it everywhere. And many people wondered if MIM was some kind of government operation. You know what I mean? It was some kind of COINTELPRO or something, because it was a little bizarre. It was more than the fact that their literature would be all over the prisons, but no one ever met anyone who was in it. And then it dissolved. And the guy who founded it, it's like, oh, it was this guy. It was this Korean guy in Ann Arbor all along. Okay, end of story. It's like, wait, what? The whole thing was just really, really, really strange. You know what I'm saying? It was just a really, really bizarre thing. And if you read about Maoist Internationalist Movement, one thing that was kind of crazy is they had movie reviews on their website, and they would write movie reviews that were wild. One of them was it was a review of the movie Independence Day. And it was about how if space aliens did invade the planet, it would be necessary to form a class collaborationist united front against the galactic imperialists. That was what the article was about, right? And how Trotskyites would want only the workers to fight the imperialists, and revisionists would want to dissolve the revolutionary movement into the Earth Liberation Forces. But Maoists understood that a class collaborationist united front to defeat the space aliens would be necessary. That was what their movie review said. I thought that was, I mean, what do you say to that? I mean, it was, and they would write movie reviews that were like that seemed like insane. Do you understand? Like, yeah, you understand? Like, you know, and yeah, it was just this communist group that was out there, that was just wacky. I don't even know what to say about it, right? And it was very secretive. And then they were pushing the Settlers book, and then the anarchist publishing company, I think it's PM Press, right? PM Press, or it was an AK Press. One of the two. There's two anarchist publishing companies, AK Press and PM Press. One of them published it. They published Settlers, and so it was published again. It was published by this anarchist press. But there's a couple radio interviews with the Jay Sakai where you can hear his voice. No one's ever met him. No one knows, I mean, where he is, who he is he still living, is he dead? But his book is everywhere. It's like, and now if you go to communism Reddit, like that's the first thing they give to anyone who gets interested in communism. If you're 15 and you live in the middle of somewhere in Idaho or Michigan and you get into communism, you get on communism Reddit, the first thing they're going to give you is Settlers. It's like handed out like water now. It is just the first thing that gets handed out. Settlers is everywhere. Read Settlers, you know, and that is very, very mysterious to me, you know?
Yep. Yeah.
And, yeah, go on.
I was able to share these kinds of moments of ridicule towards Settlers and Sakai's ideas with actually some of the same people I've talked about who have become rabid Marcyites. Years ago, those are the kinds of things we were able to bond over, because it's apparent to anybody who's really serious in any way that Settlers is incorrect. But the problem that I've been encountering is even people like that are susceptible to the kinds of arguments that the Marcyites put forth.
Mhm.
And that sort of mask off outrageous moment I was describing earlier, where somebody who was invested in PSL was arguing that the APSP was really mistaken for being so pro-Russia, and that it was their fault for how the state brought the hammer down on them. That moment really exemplified the kinds of reformist ideas, cynical ideas that orgs like PSL are propagating. They want to convince communists, including and they're able to convince even the more serious communists that the route we need to take is one of cowardice towards the state.
Yeah. I mean, you know, what's interesting is before Settlers came out, you know, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, they took the same position, that white workers are inherently reactionary. That was like the basis of the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, you know, and their beliefs, right? You know, and these ideas are not new. They've been around for a long time. You know, one thing that happened, this is kind of shows you how, you know, this is an example of Marxism and third worldism overlapping. So after I left the Workers' World Party, I think it was in 2017, there was the West Virginia teachers strike. Remember this?
I think it was before my time.
Yeah, well, it was a West Virginia. The teachers went on strike, and it was not permitted by the union. It was like a sick-in. They all called in sick at the same time because they were going to get a new healthcare plan that said they had to wear a thing on their wrist that would like monitor their health, or else they didn't get a benefit. And it was like really outrageous, the new healthcare plan they were trying to impose on West Virginia teachers. So there was basically a wildcat strike all over West Virginia. To oppose, to demand better healthcare benefits. And it was a really heroic labor uprising. All over West Virginia, the teachers went on strike. Well, in the Workers' World Party, I was not in it, but I was still friends with a lot of people that were in the party. And they told me the Detroit comrades, they were organizing as many people as they could to drive to West Virginia to support the teachers, to get on the picket lines with the teachers to support them. But the local branch of the West Virginia teachers strike, the local branch of the Workers' World Party was made up of third worldists, Sakaists. So they put a statement on the Facebook of the West Virginia Workers' World Party and said that the teachers were all Trump supporters and they're all racist. And instead of going on strike, they needed to pay reparations to colonized people. And then they put up a logo that said "One settler, one bullet." Right? And they basically were scabbing on the strike. I mean, they were, basically on the wrong side of the picket line. They were against the strike, right? Now, the Workers' World Party, they were not against the strike, and they took the correct position. However, they ended up kicking out the Detroit wing of the Workers' World Party, and not the wing, the people that were scabbing on the strike. And the Detroit, they got mad at the Detroit wing for pushing back on these psychiatrists. It was one of those wild things ever, where the people that were actually scabbing on the strike were getting protected by the party leadership, and the people that were actually trying to build solidarity with the workers from another state were the ones who got attacked by the national leadership, and they ended up driving the Detroit branch out of Workers' World Party. They formed something called the Communist Workers League. But that was a big factor, was this situation where it was better to be a psychiatrist strike breaker than it was to be a Marcyite supporting the teachers on the picket line. And it's wild because, when I was criticizing the land back movement, I said land back, that's like an excuse, right? When people are organizing, you just say, oh, we're all on stolen land anyway, right? And I had many people say to me, oh, that never happens. Yes, it does. I saw it in West Virginia. It happened. There were a group of teachers that were on strike, and these psychiatrists said, oh, they should just pay reparations, one settler, one bullet. And they didn't support the strikers, right? That often happens. The settler stuff, the land back stuff is an excuse to not get involved. When there's real struggles taking place, when there's a need to really organize, it's an excuse to just sit back and go, oh, we're all settlers on stolen land. There's no hope. This is just an evil, racist country. So I can just sit on my couch and not do anything. And there's no point anyway. That's what it is. It's an excuse. It's a way to justify not taking action. That's what I see it as, right? And that if you're feeling demoralized, if you're feeling like, oh, we're not achieving anything, that stuff is there to reinforce those feelings and to convince you to just stay home or just argue with people on the internet and feel morally superior to them, because that's what it gives you. You don't actually, it says there's no point in organizing, there's no point in joining a group, but it gives you the ability to sit there and get a smug look on your face and say, well, I'm one of the good white people. All these other people around me are a bunch of racist settlers, but I'm good. And you get to sit there in isolation and feel good about yourself. That's all it gives you. Do you know what I'm saying? That's what makes it so toxic. That's my opinion. What do you think?
The highest levels of capital are the elements that support those ideas. And right now, Jeff Bezos and the dominant wing of the Canadian ruling class are advancing a project to bring about a decolonization, so they call it, wherein an indigenous bourgeoisie is able to rule in a situation where the only thing that's really changed is that more native land has gotten transferred towards the bourgeoisie, and the only natives who are able to benefit from that are the wealthiest ones, and the most opportunistic. I'm talking about the people involved in NDN Collective, the NGO that is advancing this iteration of land back, wherein all they're doing is substituting one capitalist imperialism for another. And more broadly speaking, even if the entire continent were to be decolonized, unless that decolonization has a socialist character, the capitalist class will be able to perpetuate international monopoly capitalism.
Yeah. Well, that is true. Listen, we've been going for quite some time here. Do you want to wrap up? Do you want to say anything before we go?
I want to say that I refuse to let the developments of this last month discourage me. I refuse to let the ways that colonization has reinforced pro-Zionist sentiments make me feel discouraged, make me feel disempowered, because I think that we've learned enough so far to know that it is possible to make the alliances, the connections, the movement building maneuvers necessary for winning this class war.
All right. Well, I agree with you. So come see us both. We're both going to be in Portland. So people watching, come to Portland and come and see Rainer and I. You'll get to meet us both. And it'll be a great time. A great anti-imperialist rally, December 2nd, Portland, Oregon. So be there, everybody. So thanks, everybody, for sticking around. And I guess we'll call it a night. Thanks, Rainer.
You're welcome.
Yep. I'm going to